Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm really excited for today's topic. I've been giving it a lot of thought, primarily because so many of you have been coming to me with a very specific question. And the topic is working with apathy and a sense of resignation when things get hard and we're confronted with difficulties that may seem a little out of our control or may seem a little bit beyond our scope. So there's many iterations of this particular question. I'll try to address a bunch of them. But in general, as we talk about these things, there are circumstances in our life that are hard to grapple with. So how do we remain open? How do we remain in touch with our own awake heart and not give in to apathy and resignation? This is the big question of the day. And there's some examples that I'd like to share. One would be, someone said, what if you're diagnosed with an illness? Right? How do you balance accepting it, that this is something that's now on your plate, and mustering the courage to fight the disease with treatment? Or you're piled on top of your family during quarantine. That's another example. You need to accept their behavior to some degree, but not let them walk all over you. How do we sort of bring ourselves forward and into meaningful communication there? And then maybe even a spouse who's made a terrible blunder. Maybe it was pretty non-specific, but maybe they gambled away the car. Let's say, hopefully your spouse did not do that, but some version thereof, that there's some desire to sort of learn and accept what's going on with them and their transgression, but also we want to hold them accountable to some degree. And so much of this is, I'm very fond, and people may have heard me say this before, that the Buddha never taught a lay down and be a doormat sutra. While there is a tremendous amount of teachings on being kind and compassionate, there is no set of teachings that say, just let whatever happens happen. Just take your lumps and go on with it. I think that's actually such a horrible thing to say, and I can't imagine the Buddha would ever have said it. With all of these sorts of situations, when there are big calamities in our life or suffering is heaped in piles on our plate, we feel hurt. And we might strive to be open-hearted. And we might sense that we need to bring this suffering and these pains onto our spiritual path. These three phrases I just used of feeling hurt, wanting to feel open-hearted, wanting to bring these things onto our path, they're actually very much linked to what are known as the three yanas of Buddhism. And I'd like to actually approach this question through the three yana view. So what is this term I'm using? Yana is a term that can be translated as vehicle or path, and there are three that we often talk about within Buddhism. There are the foundational vehicles, which is sometimes referred to as the Hinayana. I don't love that. If you sense that in my voice, I don't love that term, even though I was raised with it. It's sort of Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana. This is the three yanas. It's just the way we talk about it. But the Hinayana view, very short history lesson, is somewhat derogatory. Several hundred years after the Buddha's death, there's this whole group of monastics that get together for a big conference, and they start saying, well, here's what the Buddha really emphasized. He really emphasized these core teachings that you probably even heard of in high school, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, things like that. And we should really focus just on that. And then this other group said, he also taught on compassion and emptiness and these very big concepts like that. And, we should focus our attention on that. And there was actually dispute. There's a lot of debate as to, what do we need to emphasize and to what extent. And this was the first sort of split. There was a group of people that decided to focus on the foundational teachings and a group that decided to focus on those plus the, compassion and emptiness teachings. And that second school called themselves the Mahayana school. Maha can be translated as greater. So the greater vehicle. And they named the other school Hinayana, which means lesser vehicle. Which is funny in retrospect because that doesn't sound very compassionate to be like, we're greater than you. But the idea is that they had sort of considered that they were doing a greater scope of teachings than the more narrow scope of the other group. So sometimes Hinayana is considered like a derogatory term, which is why I try to avoid it. So narrow vehicle or lesser vehicle, it doesn't sound as good as foundational vehicle, which is what I'll use. So the teachings around the foundational vehicle really are about working with ourselves and our own mind, which, is foundational for no matter what practices you do. We always have to work with our own mind and our habits and the ways that we sort of steal ourselves off from reality as it is. Big part of the foundational vehicle is that we don't want to cause harm to ourselves and others. So we look at our mind with that perspective. We say, okay, I would like to avoid causing myself more harm and more pain than the suffering that's already being heaped on my plate. So we look at our mind, we deal with our strong emotions, etc. The second yana is the Mahayana, greater vehicle. And there's a heavy emphasis in the Mahayana on living through both compassion and emptiness, and a sense of bodhicitta. So also define this term as well. It's a Sanskrit term. Bodhi being open or awake, citta being heart mind. There's not a lot of distinction in this particular translation. So the heart mind together. So we have an open or awake heart mind. And it's that soft spot, it's that tenderness that we all possess. We all possess bodhicitta. In the same way that we all have the ability to work with our mind. But we all possess bodhicitta. We go for a walk and we see a puppy sort of playing around and being very puppy-like. When our heart softens, that's bodhicitta. We have a loved one who's very ill and we're holding their hands, and that's bodhicitta. That sense of tenderness in that moment. It's everything. It's any sense of open-heartedness. It could be beautiful circumstances of a wedding. It could be horrible circumstances of a funeral. That sense of open, tender heart. So it's always available to us. And out of it flows what are known as the four immeasurables: loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, where we experience joy for the joy of others, and equanimity, which is a very powerful phrase. It's very relevant to us today, and I'll remember to circle back to equanimity. And then also there's this set of teachings on emptiness, that actually the world and ourselves are more fluid and ever-changing than we might suspect, which is also not a bad thing. And then there's this third yana. So the Buddha is said to have touched upon the Vajrayana towards the end of his life. And so there's this whole school of people that are like, this is the real jam. This is the stuff he taught at the end. And we should really emphasize this. And it's very prevalent in teachers that went from India specifically into Tibet. So you see Vajrayana teachings primarily being rooted in Tibetan Buddhism, whereas some of the other schools would go, like some of the foundational vehicle schools would go to other areas and become what's known as Theravada teachings. We'd have other schools from the Mahayana go to China, Japan, and so on, become Zen. So there's different emphasis in different schools. None of it's bad. All of it's wonderful. It's just sort of, where do you want to put your emphasis? Where do you want to invest your time? So, for people who are newer to the online community, to be clear, I'm trying to represent the three yanas all throughout our time together, because I think it's important that we sort of have many different perspectives. Sometimes you'll see me quote Zen teachers or Theravada teachers, and sometimes Tibetan Buddhist teachers. There's all sorts of things. So we get as many perspectives on this as possible, as many different parts of Buddhism as possible involved in our understanding of some of the tough issues in our life. But the Vajrayana, Vajra would be translated as indestructible. And yana, again, vehicle, indestructible. What's indestructible here? Our own wakefulness. So there's very heavy emphasis on resting in our sense of Buddha nature, our own innate wakefulness, our own natural state. And out of that, we can actually shift our view of our world from that of it being very ordinary and painstaking to maybe even that of, appreciating the details of our life and it becoming sacred. So there's a sense of sacred view. How does this relate to any of our things? So for example, in the first turning, or the foundational vehicle, when we look at this set of teachings, what we're essentially talking about is being with our mind in the midst of our difficulty. So if we are diagnosed with an illness, we might feel scared. We might feel claustrophobic in our body. We might feel a sense of uncertainty. If our family members are pissing us off in quarantine, like gesturing in my door, then we might look at the dishes stacked in the sink and the clothes everywhere, and people are loud when we're working and all of that. And then we feel angry. There's anger arising. There's frustration. With a spouse who gambles away the car, again, that's a random example, I realize. but we feel betrayed or we feel hurt. We feel deep sadness. So these are, we sort of need to say, oh, there's the stories around what happened. And then we look and say, what's underneath that story? What feelings are present? What strong emotions are present when suffering lands on my plate? And we can work with the strong emotions to start. That's an important place to start, to actually own and look at our own strong emotions. So we take a step back. We don't immediately react. We don't immediately rip the door open and yell at our spouse or our kids, or in my case, you might even hear cats. They're probably well justified. I'm not sure if my wife fed them breakfast. So, but there's this sense of like we take a step back. We don't immediately react. We don't vomit our emotions onto others. We take some time even to care for ourselves. Maybe we take a walk. I'm looking outside. It's beautiful. It's sunny out right now. Like a walk can even enrich our senses. I'll come back to the sense of enrichment in a little bit as well. Maybe we have a cup of tea. Maybe we do something that helps move the body. We exercise in some way. Maybe we practice meditation at that moment. But we step back from the situation just a little, long enough to even acknowledge what I'm feeling. Once we know what we're feeling, we can actually learn to embrace who we are and embrace what's going on. We're learning to feel what we feel. There's likely so many layers to this. So when we feel betrayed, when our spouse does something that hurts us, there's the betrayal, there's the sadness, there's the frustration, etc. So some of these layers are based not just on what's currently happening, might have been based on what's been happening for years. Maybe we felt some of these things for a very long time. So it's important for us to spend probably more time than we think we ought to being with our strong emotions. And if you are, in any of these situations where you feel like there's a lot of suffering on your plate, it's a good time to engage in not just shamatha, calm abiding meditation, mindfulness of the breath, but also rain practice as a way to work with the strong emotions in a real process, that we recognize what's going on with them, we allow some space to feel what we feel, we investigate them, and then we actually go through a moment of like, oh, I can expand my view. I don't have to be so attached or overly identify with them. It's the non-attachment or non-identification event. So there's these guided recordings for you in the guided recordings folder for both mindfulness practice, shamatha, and rain. And those might be very helpful during this time to, if you're feeling these sorts of ways. So we really spend more time than we think we need to looking at our own mind so that we don't cause ourselves more harm and we don't cause harm for other people. So that's one thing that we can do. But then when we open up to the Mahayana teachings, we realize that there's also things that then when we emerge from having gained more clarity and more groundedness in our situation, that we can act in certain ways. Once we've stepped back, we can even look to seek understanding from the other person. We go out there and, it's a silly example, but this is just what's happening beyond the door. I go out there and I look at the cats and I say, why are you so loud? And they say, oh, it's because you haven't eaten. And of course my heart softens because that's not their fault. They're just letting me know they haven't eaten. It's that sort of thing, right? So it's like even taking a moment to seek to understand what's going on instead of like going at someone is very important. What's going on with you? Where is this coming from? I'm not going to go through all of these, the illness and the being on top of the family and all of this, but these are just examples of like, can we seek to understand the perspectives of other people? Thich Nhat Hanh is fond of talking about this equation that he uses where he says, understanding is another name for love. If we can't understand, we're not going to be able to love someone. So if we're trying to get into that sense of bodhicitta, open our awake heart mind, then we need to actually start to seek to open and like find a point of connection that we can seek understanding. And that can be the access point for further love and compassion. So how are other people feeling about our situation? Can we open our perspective long enough not to say, oh, and they're right, and this is exactly, I forgive them because of that? Not at all. But we just start to seek to understand. We seek to understand the perspective of others. So how do we do this work? How do we show up for ourselves and for others from that place of open or awake heart, bodhicitta. This is the time that it might be very helpful to consider loving kindness practice, because in loving kindness practice we bring to mind different people that we like, that we don't like, that we don't know. We also even include ourselves, and we offer aspirations for our well-being. May I be happy. May I feel healthy if we are feeling ill. May I feel safe if we feel betrayed. May I be free of fear if we are feeling like there's an anxiety and fear plaguing us right now. We make these aspirations for ourselves, and turning our attention to this is not like we say, may I be happy, and then we forever live from a place of happiness, but we're actually turning our attention in that direction, which we may not normally do. We may normally just put on the blinders and just focus on the problem at hand, whatever our problem at hand may be. Illness, betrayal, frustration, etc. We might just put on the blinders and say, well, I got to deal with this thing. What we're doing in meditation is we take the blinders off and we realize, oh my gosh, there's so much more going on right now. Look, there's this beautiful blue sky, and there's this wonderful hardwood floor. Like, there's actual other things going on. So loving kindness can help shift us out of just me and my thing into a sense of expansiveness of view. So it's a good practice. And if we are working with people who are suffering a great deal, we might even want to consider doing Tonglen practice. And again, of course, these are all practices that are in the guided recordings folder that are available to you, but this is the practice where we really contemplate the suffering of an individual, and then all sorts of individuals who are working from in that way, experiencing that sort of pain and suffering. So these are very much considered Mahayana practices, where we actually open our and wake up our heart to others. And practices where we really come to realize our humanity and their humanity. We start to contemplate and understand who they are at their core. And when we look at that, we realize we all suffer. Somehow knowing that it's not just us that's suffering, it's sort of like weird as it is. It's like, oh, it's nice to know that everyone else is suffering too. It's not just a me thing. It's a human thing. And if we have been wronged by another person, again, I want to just emphasize that we're not immediately saying, okay, and now having done living kindness practice or having done Tonglen practice, I forgive this person. But we could consider their perspective. And we can consider how we want to approach our relationship, how we want to approach our conversations and our speech from a place of understanding. Maybe that means clearly communicating our needs to other people in our life. Maybe it means clearly communicating our emotions and how we're feeling and why we're feeling this way. Maybe it means that we do all of this without an expectation of how anyone should meet that or how they should react. Simply being open to how we will be received. We don't know what will happen. Some of us might say, oh my gosh, if I talk to my family about some of these things that are in my head, they'd all disown me. I can't do that during the quarantine. So, I think it's there is some bravery of saying, like, I'm going to work with my own emotions, and then I'm going to find, ways to seek understanding and put myself out there from a place of compassion. I want to talk a little bit about different ways that we manifest compassion. Particularly if someone's, coming at us and there is some sense of, like, their suffering is meeting our suffering, and then our suffering is now compounded. We might even ask ourselves, when we look at this person, do I think this person is in pain? Or do I think this person's coming from the best version of themselves? Whichever you prefer. Doing so might even cut through our dualistic thing of, like, me versus them. It might help us see in that moment the one thing that we have in common, which is that we're both suffering. When we realize I am suffering and you are suffering, that's when compassion can bloom. Another access point for understanding might even be contemplating how they appeared as they were a small child. We might even do this in loving kindness practice for ourselves or for others. But even just on the spot, imagining. I have this picture I was looking at old pictures of my spouse yesterday, and there's something about, like, this one image of her that even if I got frustrated with her, there'd be a good thing for me to reflect on and say, oh, remember this sweet child who got so hurt in different parts of her life. There's some sense of, like, oh, that tenderness just arises when we remember that this person isn't a walking ball of whatever your issue is that day. It's like they have been around for so long and had so many sweet iterations. And it could be, I mean, I use the example of a spouse because I happened to have been looking at a picture of my spouse the other day. But, it could even be imagining, your vile coworker as a young child and what they might have been like. I could go on at length about this, but I want to talk about so once we have some entryway into understanding this person, entryway into contemplating their humanity, what do we do with that? And there's a set of teachings on compassion that are known as the 4 karmas. Karmas, plural, just means 4 activities. So 4 types of activities that we could actually engage in when we want to engage other people from a place of compassion. And these 4 are pacifying, enriching, magnetizing, and destroying. I'll go through all 4. Pacifying. An example being, your loved one comes to you and they're really suffering from work stress or overwhelm, and you offer a shoulder for them to cry on. You just hold space and you listen to them. You don't try and fix it. That's pacifying. You're just creating enough space for them to do what they need to do. Pacifying energy. Giving them a hug. Enriching is a sense of enriching their experience. So I used an example earlier, if your loved one is going through a very dark time, you say, why don't we go outside and it's beautiful and let's take a walk. And even just sort of getting out of their dark corner of a room and bringing them outside and bringing them maybe to nature, and they raise their view and there's some sense of enrichment that's taking place because they're feeling, oh, look, there's more than just what I saw when I put those blinders on. Magnetizing is a sense of, I'll give an example. I have a friend who runs a business and sometimes it's faltering and he gets very stressed out because he doesn't know how he's ever going to keep going. And I say, I know someone who does that. Maybe you want to meet with them. Maybe you can learn something from them, or, we sort of brainstorm resources for them. And that can be really helpful. So we're magnetizing resources. In the same way, if someone comes to me and says, I'm struggling with X, Y, and Z, and I might be able to talk to them about it, but I'll say, there's a good book on this that I'd like to recommend. It's magnetizing resources so they have more resources to work with. It's a form of compassion. And then the last one would be destroying, which is probably, I realize, the sexiest of these. It sounds like, ooh, what is that about? Compassion. But, the idea here is sometimes when we are, along the lines of not laying down and being a doormat sutra, sometimes when we are trying to be kind, it doesn't always look like nice. It doesn't always just mean we say the nice thing, we say the pleasant thing, and everyone's happy about it. Sometimes it looks like we need to say the hard thing. And that may not always be what people want to see or hear, but it's ultimately of the best benefit to them. So when we come at something from really trying to be of benefit to someone, offer compassion, sometimes that might look a little destructive. It might, for example, my go-to example is always that of a friend. I have another friend who for many years would, he would be with a woman and then she would cheat on him and he would come crash on my couch in New York City for a number of weeks, and then he would go back home to Boston, and then I'd ask how he was doing. A week later he'd go, oh, I'm fine. And then I'd check in a week later and I'd say, how are you doing? He goes, well, the last couple of weeks I've been dating that person again. I said, okay. And then, maybe 2 months pass and same thing. He's crashing on my couch for a couple of weeks. My roommate's a little annoyed. This is early 20s stuff. And, after the 5th iteration of that cycle where my roommate's now talking to me about whether this guy should start paying rent, I do sit down with him and I say, can we look at this pattern? Can we look at the pattern that you keep going back to this person? You keep getting hurt by this person. You keep coming here, healing to the bare minimum, and going back. This can't feel good to you. And ultimately, when we sort of unpacked it, he's like, you know what, you're right. And I don't want to do it anymore. So there's some sense of that's not what he wanted to hear. He wanted to hear, the first couple times, good for you, get back together. I'm so glad you're making it work. And that's actually not the best beneficial thing. The best beneficial thing is to take a step back and can we look at this and can we talk about it? And, at first he resisted it. And then he sort of came around and he's like, you're right. So there's that sort of sense of I'm trying to be of benefit to you, even though it's not necessarily what you want to hear, or what you want to do, or what you want to see. It's a petty example, but like taking the dog to the vet. We know that it's important that the dog goes to the vet for whatever the shot or the medicine or whatever it might be, but the dog hates this. And we're like, no, I promise you, I wish you could understand me, that I'm doing this for your benefit, even though this is like not what you want to do. So it's something like destructive of like your idea of like what you want to do here, and I'm actually going to go ahead and say this is actually a benefit. We may not always know the best thing for them, which is why, I use the example of like just unpacking a situation with someone might be the thing that actually helps them cut through their own neurosis, their own confusion. So these are 4 ways that we might be able to actually offer compassion to others. And I want to double back and say these are also 4 ways we could offer compassion to ourselves. Pacifying, offer ourselves resources to sort of like give ourselves space to go through what we need to go through. Enriching, and taking ourselves for a walk or going to a museum or something that feels enriching to us. Magnetizing, bringing in resources, even like I mentioned before, like, oh, I'm going through heartbreak. Maybe I should look into some books on heartbreak and actually like dive in and be with them, and destruction, really looking at some of the things that we might need to cultivate more of in our life, some things that we might need to cut out. These could be forms of compassion for ourselves. And then finally, we get to the Vajrayana, which is obviously, everyone always thinks of the Vajrayana stuff is very sexy as well. It's a little counter to what we might normally do, because what we're saying here is we're looking to even the difficult parts of our life as part of our path. This is a difference in view from what we might normally do. We might normally say, I want to get rid of the suffering. I want to get rid of the difficulty. And the Vajrayana view is, oh, look, there's difficulty. This is how I grow spiritually. How interesting. What a blessing that I have an opportunity to grow spiritually. So even the frustrating parts, the scary parts are the ways that we grow. And there is some aspect that as we go through and navigate the difficulties of our life, that we are viewing the world as sacred. That we could actually maintain sacred view. When we're in the shower and the water is hitting our skin and it feels hot and warm, and we say, oh, I can just rest here and appreciate that's sacred. When we take a sip of our tea or of our wine and we actually enjoy it, that feels sacred. So there's something like about simply enjoying this moment and resting in our own wakefulness in on the spot ways. That's the Vajrayana. And within it is the notion that we are all inherently good, whole, complete as is. In illness, betrayal, frustrating family members, these things don't negate the fact that we have wakefulness within us, that we can always call upon. That we actually have, in some traditions we would refer to this as basic goodness. Basic being innate, inherent, primordial, fundamental, foundational to who we are. This inherent quality. And the goodness isn't like a Star Wars good versus bad thing. It's like a sense of wholeness, completeness, that we have everything we need inside of us. So there's some basic goodness in the moment. When we actually get out of our own way for a second and we just drop all of the stories and we're just present, there's a sense of, oh, I'm okay. We don't need to flee to the past. We don't need to flee to the future. We can appreciate this moment as it is. And I would say, to a large degree, appreciation is the antidote to apathy. So we're learning to be with our life as opposed to it being something we need to struggle against. That's the Vajrayana view. But it's also the view that's built upon through the foundational vehicle in the Mahayana as well. That this is what's happening right now. Good, bad, happy, or sad is what's happening right now. So if we are going through, last thing I'll say about this is if we are going through deep difficulty and deep turmoil, and we say, I don't know if this is ever going to end. The good news is, the Buddha also taught about the truth of impermanence, that even the difficult things in our life will change, I promise. This is good news for those hardships. They too will change. So I hope that something in here in these 3 yana view is helpful in terms of relating to some of the difficulties in your life, that we can actually set aside resignation or apathy and show up for our life and for the people in our life from a place of working with strong emotions, opening our heart, and bringing this difficulty into our spiritual path so that we grow more fully. I look forward to talking with you about this on our monthly call and hearing more about your perspective and your questions. Take care.